Hey everybody, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight, in the final session in our third season, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the movie adaptation of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and tangentially, parenthetically, also wrap up our discussion of the book too, I suppose. During the live commentary, we talked, and if you haven't heard that live commentary, by the way, go back one step in your podcast feed where you will find me talking over the entirety of the movie. That was a really fun experience, and I urge you to sit down with your DVD, with your Blu-ray of Prisoner of Azkaban, and watch along with, not so much along with me, though certainly that's an experience that you should have, but along with everyone who joined the live chat during that discussion. That was a ton of fun, and yes, to answer the questions that I've already received, we will definitely be going back and doing live commentaries for Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets too, as well as conducting live commentaries for all of the rest of the movies in the series. During that live commentary, though, we talked a lot about the adaptive choices made by Cuarón in the context of both the Prisoner of Azkaban movie as it relates to the book and the Prisoner of Azkaban movie as it relates to the first two movies in the series. We will talk more about that this evening, as well as taking some general questions, but we're going to focus really on what Prisoner of Azkaban as a film does, not just the adaptive choices, but what the adaptive choices mean, where the focus of the story is. As I say, we're also going to take some questions. This is going to be a slightly different feeling episode of Dear Mr. Potter because, well, this is our last chance to talk about Azkaban, and I'm kind of getting that end of term feeling. I'm kind of feeling like it's the last day of classes before the summer vacation at Hogwarts, where, I don't know, Minerva McGonagall sets aside her class schedule and instead teaches the kids how to tie-dye t-shirts, and whichever Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher we have this year takes the kids out into the quad or out onto the Quidditch field and does some Expelliarmus skeet shooting with them, or Hagrid, I don't know, doesn't endanger the entire student body with some fierce and fearsome magical creatures. It's kind of that feeling that we're going to get this evening from Dear Mr. Potter, and I'm glad that you could all join me. We have Katie and Alexis and Elizabeth and John and Angela and Becca. We have a couple of people joining us for the first time, I say as I scroll back. Shannon is joining us for the first time, assuming that Shannon made it to the start of the live session. There was some fear from Shannon that she might fall asleep, which I completely understand. This is not a terribly friendly time zone for many people, or a time slot, I should say, for many people. Matt is joining us for the first time here on Crowdcast. Matt joined us back in the YouTube days when the audio quality was not always what it should be. I'm hopeful that tonight's session will be a little more pleasant on the ears than some of those old YouTube sessions were. And we have Malphidus joining us. Malphidus, is your name a direct reference to the Malfoy family? I know that in some European versions, I think possibly the German, certainly the Dutch versions of Harry Potter, Malphidus is the name of the Malfoy family. Is that a direct pull? Because if so, very good. You get a bonus point and a cookie. 5 house points for your chosen house, I suppose. Jillian says this is her first live session too. Good to have you with us, Jillian. And Angela is watching The Mummy for tomorrow night's one-shot discussion over at Point North. The Mummy from 1999, the Brendan Fraser, John Hannah movie. It's a great movie. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Before we get to our discussion of Azkaban, though, a couple of quick scheduling announcements. Next week, we are going to take our first Dear Mr. Potter field trip. We are going to leave behind the safe seclusion of Hogwarts and the world of J.K. Rowling and venture to the exotic archipelago of Earthsea. That's right. Next week, we begin our discussion of Ursula K. Le Guin's seminal young adult fantasy story, A Wizard of Earthsea, originally published in 1968. I have been talking about this for a little while. This is part of a plan that I have here. As we're going to move more rapidly through the Harry Potter books than we have previously, we're going to take brief respites between each of the Harry Potter books to look at a text which will help to inform our understanding of J.K. Rowling's world and narrative. And we're going to begin, as I say, with A Wizard of Earthsea. As of this recording, I am planning 5 weeks for A Wizard of Earthsea, which works out very nicely to 2 chapters a week. It's a very short novel. That will take us right up to Christmas. So I am proud and pleased to announce that we will begin our discussion of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire on January the 2nd, 2018. An implausibly futuristic sounding date, which will nonetheless be upon us in just a few short weeks. As of this moment, I am planning 14 sessions looking at the novel of Goblet of Fire and at least one probably 2, possibly 3, looking at the movie of Goblet of Fire. So that's going to carry us through definitely to the end of April, I guess. But by the end of 2018, we will have Goblet and Order of the Phoenix under our belts, as well as a couple of other texts as well. And we will do our level best to get through both Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows in 2019. So a lot coming your way here on the Dear Mr. Potter podcast. A lot of people very excited about that. That's wonderful. Wizard of Earthsea, says John, haven't read it in ages. I am hoping that that is going to be the response from a lot of people. I hope that this is a book that many of you read years ago and can now return to with much greater acuity, because Wizard of Earthsea is one of those books that will absolutely stand up to really whatever kind of scrutiny you want to apply to it, but certainly the kind of close reading textual narrative scrutiny that we tend to engage with here on the Dear Mr. Potter podcast, that is a book that will just open up to that kind of analysis. It's absolutely fascinating and a great companion to Harry Potter. So whether you read it years ago or you've never read it, or you believe up until this point that you don't even like A Wizard of Earthsea, I hope that you will come with me on this 5-week journey through the Earthsea archipelago. John says, one of the advantages of having spent 6 years in seminary, I have an appreciation of the boarding school bits. Very fair. I should say, for those of you who haven't read A Wizard of Earthsea, it is about a young man who proves himself to be possessed of a surprising magical power, and then he goes to a wizarding school where an ancient evil is unleashed upon the world, and he takes it upon himself to address that ancient evil. It's not entirely fair to say that it reads like the entirety of the Harry Potter series in 60,000 words, but it kind of does. Certainly there are parallels and overlaps there that I think many of you will enjoy. Yes. Good. Okay. That's not, though, the only announcement that I have to make. You guys are very lucky tonight, because this is the first time that I'm talking about something that I have wanted to talk about basically for forever. I have a new class that is going to be announced as of this live recording tomorrow. By the time the podcast drops, this class will be announced and registration will be open. I am so excited for this brand new class. I urge you all to take part in it. Let me share the title of this class. Here it is: Between Worlds, Exploring Folklore, Fairy, and Fantasy. Yes, this is the fantasy class, the fairy tale class, the folklore class that I have been promising basically since I started podcasting a decade ago. I am finally getting around to it. This is going to be a 6-week class, which begins on Monday, January the 8th, 2018. This is going to be, I should say, a pretty dedicated class. There's going to be a fair amount of reading associated with this class. There are going to be homework assignments and discussions associated with this class. So I need to limit the number of spaces. I need to limit the number of students who will be able to take this class. So if you're interested in this, then hop on it. If you know someone, if you're married to someone who is potentially interested in this, gift certificates will be available, but don't sleep on that. If you want this class, you should definitely sign up for it, because I really have to cap the class. I'm thinking at like 20. I think 20 is probably going to be enough, and I expect those to sell out pretty quickly. In this 6-week class, I'm going to look at basically the entire history of fairy stories. I'm going to look at their origins in ancient folklore. We're going to begin by talking about, the oldest narrative traditions. We're going to be talking about the Edda, and we're going to be talking about, Scheherazade, and we're going to be talking about the way that the oldest myths and folklore stories kind of wove themselves through our culture, even before they could be codified by the written word. Then we're going to look at the medieval tradition of fairy tales and fairy stories. We're going to be talking about Sir Orfeo, and we're going to be talking about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Then we're going to be talking about the Elizabethan fairy tradition, and we're definitely going to be talking about The Fairy Queen by Spenser. Not in a great deal of depth. That's quite a work, but we're going to skim it, certainly, and look at the high points of The Fairy Queen. And we're also going to be talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, one of the major turning points in the evolution of fairy tale literature. We're going to be talking about Charles Perrault, and we're going to be talking about the Brothers Grimm, and we're going to be talking about Hans Christian Andersen, and we're going to be talking about the Victorian response to fairy tale stories. We're going to be talking about The Princess and the Goblin by Scottish author George MacDonald, one of the formative works of fantasy, but also a really engaging fairy tale in its own right. We're going to be talking about Peter Pan, of course, by J.M. Barrie. We're going to be talking then in the modern era about the Disney response to fairy tales, the Disneyfication of fairy tales. We're going to be talking about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. We're going to be talking about The Little Mermaid. And we're going to be talking, interestingly, about Coraline as we track the movement of fairy, capital F, fairy, the realm of fairies, which of course I've discussed on and off here on the Dear Mr. Potter podcast. We're going to be talking about that as it moves from folklore into fairy tale, into fantasy, and then ultimately into a kind of retro naturalistic magical realism, which I think is pretty much where fairy stories are found today. So I'm super excited about this class. As you can tell, that is the Between Worlds class, exploring folklore, fairy, and fantasy. By the time the podcast drops tomorrow, if you're watching this live, or right now, if you're listening to the podcast version, you'll be able to find out more and register over on pointnorthmedia.com. I hope that you are as excited about this class as I am. I know I'm already getting people calling out other titles that I could be discussing. I will be alighting upon the heavy hitters, but I want to try and keep the reading list under control so that we can move through and pick out the high points. But yes, there are just so many. I'm so glad that you're all excited. This is wonderful. Okay, let's, as I rearrange my studio space here and lift the Manhattan, which is accompanying me this evening, because as I say, this somewhat loose and lazy end of term feeling is somewhat contagious. With that all said, let's get into our discussion of the movie version of Azkaban. Most of the changes wrought by the movie version to the structure of the story themselves force a fascinating and some would argue necessary change on the shape of the story as a whole. I absolutely understand the desire of the book reader to see the text manifested on screen to the limits of the director's ability to do so. Certainly, I'm interested in the idea of the firebolt showing up in the middle of the school year. I'm interested in the way that we talk about the Fidelis charm within the pages of the book and the way in which that story is cut entirely from the movie, or the way that Moony, Wormfoot, Padtail, and Padfoot and Prongs are cut entirely, pretty much, from the text of the movie itself, as well, of course, as the backstory with Snape. The Marauder's Map really doesn't get much backstory in the movie version. We don't get multiple trips to Hogsmeade. We don't have Ron and Hermione, fighting and bickering for the better part of the school year. But the consequence of all of these structural changes is focus. I called this week's session More Punch, partly, of course, because we get the brilliant Hermione punch, which is one of the greatest moments in the Harry Potter series for me. I love that moment, and I love the change. And as I said during the live commentary track, that was not supposed to be a change. When they were originally shooting that scene, Hermione was supposed to slap Draco, just as she does in the books, but Emma Watson, inadvertently slapped Tom Felton a little harder than she meant to. So they changed the way that the shot was aligned, changed the way that they were looking at this action, and allowed Hermione instead to extend her arm in the punch rather than move her arm laterally in the slap, which made for a better shot, but much more importantly, empowered Hermione Granger as a character to a phenomenal extent. I absolutely love, and I've talked before about the ways in which I love the degendering of that act of physical aggression from Hermione. I love that it is rendered now, albeit accidentally, but Death of the Author tells us that accidents don't really count for much. I love the way that it is presented now in this fascinatingly degendered way. This is not a girl hitting a boy, which is possible interpretation of the slap in the pages of the book. This is just a person hitting another person, which of course I don't support in real life, but when it's Hermione and it's Draco, it's pretty good. It's actually pretty good. So because we tighten our focus, we are left with a story which is much more immediately and dynamically about Harry and the threat of Sirius Black, much less about Sirius as an individual, much less about Sirius as a man, and certainly much less about Sirius with regard in relation to Harry himself. Instead, the movie is primarily preoccupied with Harry and his experience of being under lockdown in Hogwarts. The threat of Sirius Black is what matters most. And because of that, we lose much of what the book has to say about crime and punishment, which we talked about a great deal. The threat of Black is so much more specific and significant that there's just no way to engage with the broader ramifications of Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban, or incarceration in Azkaban in the first place, or the specific threat that he poses to Harry. He's just a monster for much of the running time of the movie in a way that he isn't really in the book. And when I say he isn't in the book, of course, literally in the pages of the book, he pretty much is. There are a few hints dropped, but for the reader who is kind of occupying this privileged and dramatically ironic position of knowledge, we get to see more of Sirius. We get to understand more of Sirius than Harry does in his individual moments. So we do much less to challenge the idea of Harry Potter as a juvenile story and Harry himself as a juvenile hero. We don't really... Well, I was going to say that we don't really engage with that in the text of the film. We don't really engage with that structurally in the text of the film. Narratively, we don't engage with it in the text of the film. But of course, we do engage with it very purposefully, very meaningfully in the aesthetic of the film, in the visual and audio design of the film, even in the directorial choices that are made by our actors and drawn out by our incredibly gifted director, Alfonso Cuarón. Let me see as I catch up here with the chat. Gosh, a lot of chat that wasn't scrolling for me. I thought you guys were being very quiet as I rambled on about the movie, but it turns out not so much. Becca Eller, the wonderful Becca Eller, says, I love how much Hermione is growing through the book. It's really a bridge for her between child and woman. She gets to be really feminine in Goblet. She absolutely does get to be really feminine in Goblet. I do think there's an argument that we also lose track of Hermione a little bit in Goblet, but I would rather have Hermione be too much to be contained on the page consistently and thoroughly than too little to be contained on the page consistently and thoroughly. So you're absolutely right. And this is one of the many ways in which I would argue that Prisoner of Azkaban is the turning point. I think that's true of the books. I think that is objectively, literally true of the movies. The tonal difference in the third Harry Potter film is so striking that it absolutely leads into Goblet of Fire and everything that we get from the rest of that series. But the foundation, I actually just read the beginning of Goblet of Fire again today, and thinking about the approach to that book, thinking about where we are coming into that book, Prisoner of Azkaban is absolutely necessary, and the changes wrought on our understanding of Harry's personal experience and Harry's relationships and Harry's character, Harry's family, the interaction of the wizarding world and the muggle world. All of these things are absolutely necessary. They're absolutely required of the reader before you get to Goblet of Fire. If you can imagine closing the last page of Chamber of Secrets, if you inexplicably manage to shuffle the order of these books and you read Philosopher's Stone and you read Chamber of Secrets and then somehow you crack open Goblet of Fire, it's like you're reading a completely different series. So while Goblet is in many ways more conspicuously a turning point for the series as a whole, all of that groundwork is laid by Azkaban. And as I've been talking throughout the entire series, I love the thematic ambition of the novel, the Prisoner of Azkaban novel. And of course, some of that is lost by the tighter focus of the movie, the more kind of mechanistic and structurally elemental approach that the movie takes. But as I say, a lot of that thematic intent is reflected in the aesthetic of the film. And I'm not sure to what degree that's intentional, honestly. I'm not sure to what degree we are supposed to see echoes of our adolescent and, imminently post-adolescent response to the legalistic and civil structures of the wizarding world. We've had this discussion throughout the run of the novel. This is the novel that starts to cast a shadow on the Ministry of Magic, honestly, and starts to cast a shadow on the authority structures in Harry's life in every possible direction, in every possible way. Shadows have fallen upon Harry's world, which is completely consistent with his growing awareness of the broader world. We don't quite get that in the movie, but we do get some aesthetic reference points which are, I think, somewhat compatible. And I do think that the movie manages to make a distilled version. And of course, when I'm talking about the movie as an adaptation, when I'm talking about movies as adaptations, we have to think about the amount of real estate that we have to play with here. Novels can be extraordinarily dense. J.K. Rowling's work, honestly, isn't ever really that dense. She generally communicates in a fairly open and airy and transparent way to the reader. There are individual lines, individual paragraphs, individual scenes in the later books in the series which will shift our understanding of the world quite substantially, but generally speaking, it's a pretty open experience. But movies are are just different beasts. They're just necessarily mechanically and structurally different. They have a great communicative ability. You can show things on screen that would take page after page after page of description. You can show them in a fraction of a second. Similarly, you can do something in a line on the page that you have to invest in on the screen. So it's never quite fair, I think, to look at the length of a novel and try and map it to the length of a movie. I don't necessarily think that that's a smart or insightful means of comparing, the lengths, and certainly not to look at the lengths of other adaptations and take those as some kind of template, take those as some kind of metric for adaptation. This discussion, of course, is one that I've been having on the internet for years, ever since Peter Jackson announced that the Hobbit prequel trilogy was going to move from 2 movies to 3 movies. And the response of the internet was, really, though? Are you kidding? Because that's a pretty short book, and you're really going to fill up 3 hours? And it turns out that the running time of the Hobbit trilogy is about 9 hours. And the audiobook running time for The Hobbit is like 11 hours, pretty much the same, actually, as Prisoner of Azkaban. So it's much less compressed than you would necessarily expect it to be. Though I do think, again, that tightening focus there makes all the difference. Let me catch up with the chat again. The chat is not scrolling for me tonight, so I'm having to manually scroll again. This is a weird bug with Crowdcast, but Tolkien Lover is joining us tonight. Hello, Tolkien Lover. Glad to have you with us. Let me see here. Adaptations are their own world, says Gildarts Winters. Absolutely, absolutely. Though, I mean, the job of Prisoner of Azkaban as an adaptation is an interesting one, both because it exists as an adaptation of a fantastically popular novel, but also because it exists within a narrative context already. Cuarón wasn't coming in and creating a new world. He wasn't coming in and creating a new visual style. He was coming in and evolving a world, evolving a style, evolving a tone. He was working with actors who perhaps wouldn't have been his first choice. He was working with sets and with concepts and with conceits that arguably would not have been his first choice in a straight adaptation of this book. So it is an interesting piece of adaptation in that it reflects both the book and the previous 2 films too. And of course, that's going to be true of every subsequent film that we come to. And I'm very eager to talk about those adaptations. As I say, I don't think that any of them are as successful. I like them all. I think they're all very good, honestly. I do think that the adaptation of Order of the Phoenix falters a little bit when it ought not to falter. And certainly the decision to split Deathly Hallows into 2 movies rather, does extend our engagement. And there are choices made about where we move things in that duology, which don't necessarily sit well with me, but I generally enjoy all of the movies. But yes, that kind of reflexive adaptation, that adaptation within an established world is an additional challenge for the filmmaker, and something that Cuarón manages to do, I think, beautifully, manages to absolutely evolve Harry Potter without breaking it. There isn't I'm trying to think of an example now of a director coming into an existing series and absolutely changing everything. I will think on that. The closest thing that I can think of is the J.J. Abrams reboot of Star Trek, which did, I think, do what Cuarón's adaptation here could have done, which is completely miss the point, right? Like, create something that is good unto itself, but is completely separate, so completely separate from everything that has gone before that it is, a reboot, right? We'll talk more about J.J. Abrams' Star Trek at some point in the future. I'm sure. I keep circling back around to it. So if it is a good movie, is it a fantastic beast? Says Katie. We will definitely talk about Fantastic Beasts. I am one of those few people who will go to bat for that movie. I like that movie a great deal. As I've said before, I think I like that movie as a fantasy story. I like that movie as a piece of alternate history. I like that movie as just a whimsical confection. I don't love that movie as Harry Potter. I don't love that movie within the frame of, and perhaps that's actually the reference point that I should go to, right? For what Cuarón did with Prisoner of Azkaban. He could have come in and given us a Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. He could have given us something that is so fundamentally different from our expectation of Harry Potter that it would break our immersion into that world. That is not entirely the fault of the filmmakers behind Fantastic Beasts. Obviously they're dealing with a framework which is very different, but yeah, I will go to bat for that movie. I definitely will. Let me see. Jillian says, in the POA movie, they're wearing muggle clothes half the time instead of school robes. They're not just students anymore. Very good observation, right? We get this most notably, I think, in the Hogsmeade sequence, where we get to see the kids in their civilian garb, and it's civilian garb that is completely indistinguishable from muggle civilian garb, as it should be, right? This is another way in which we're freeing our characters from the restrictions of their juvenile experience. And that's a completely organic thing. This is not a creation of J.K. Rowling. This is not a creation of Quaron. This is something that is completely organic to the adolescent coming of age tale. And now we're getting to see that on screen. We're getting to see that represented. But that's a really great pull, Jillian. Yes, absolutely. Let me see. Oh, Angela says that the books are more dense after analyzing them through Dear Mr. Potter and Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Well, yes, there is a lot there. I will say that. And J.K. Rowling, I think, is deceptively and frequently derided as a superficial writer. And I don't think that that's entirely fair. I think she has moments of absolute majesty in her prose, and the decision to be accessible and transparent is clearly a conscious one, and we can tell it's a conscious one because the restraint with which she modulates out of that register is masterful and is itself conspicuous. Yeah. Let me see here. Alexis says that basically the entirety of my aesthetic board for Alistair. Alexis has been making Pinterest aesthetic boards for those of us from Common Room Radio and Point North Media. And Alexis says, like, basically the entirety of my aesthetic board for Alistair are things I would put in a Newt board minus all the Hufflepuff scarves. You know what? Fair, right? Newt Scamander as a Ravenclaw, I'll take that. That's not a bad life. That's not a bad characterization right there. Yeah. We've got Lord Valuemart is joining us here in the chat. That's a very good name. That's a very good name. I'm a big fan of that. Good. And a lot of love for Fantastic Beasts. That's great. Yeah, well, we'll definitely get a chance to talk about that as we get through that. Good. So let's take a look at some of the excuse me. Some of the differences that we get in the movie, the specific differences and the changes that are wrought upon the structure and the narrative intent of the story by those changes. Why do we make the changes that we make? Some of them are just decluttering a story that has 12 hours to run in the audiobook version and has 2.5 hours to run in the movie version, right? There's no need for the firebolt, so we just dismiss it. We just shuffle it off. There's no need for Sirius's friendship with Crookshanks, right? We don't have to go down that road, so we don't. There's nothing really of value there. I mean, arguably in the book, you can infer a thematic statement behind that about Sirius being now more comfortable in the company of animals than he is with men, but really that's a low tier thematic statement in the book, so we don't really need to focus on it. The Fidelis charm and the history of the Marauders is something very different, though. The choices to kind of generalize Harry's interactions with his parents, his remote, separated at one remove interaction with his parents in this movie, and it's not even the simplification of the backstory, I guess, as much as it is just the refusal to give adequate detail of the backstory in the course of this movie. I think that those are intentional choices which, while they are infuriating to book readers, are smart in a way, because one of the things that the Harry Potter series is doing already, started doing really, I mean, okay, the high level concept of Harry Potter drags our awareness of the narrative out of the present. What is the story of Harry Potter? Well, he's the boy who lived. Yes, he's the boy who goes to wizard school and makes just smashing chums and has big adventures, but he's the boy who lived. Harry's experience of the world is always kind of temporally dislocated. He's always existing in more than one temporal space, more than one time. He's at Hogwarts, yes, in the early 90s, but he's also the baby who faces down, Lord Voldemort faces down, probably gives him a little more agency than he deserves in that moment, but yes, he's the boy who lives. And what J.K. Rowling does as we move through, certainly Chamber of Secrets and the introduction of the Tom Riddle storyline and kind of I mean, arguably even at the end of Philosopher's Stone, when we have that scene between Dumbledore and Harry in which Dumbledore reveals why it is that Snape is so inconsistently antagonistic to Harry, we are telling the story of Harry's experience, yes, but we're also telling the story of James's experience. We're also telling this temporally dislocated story. Then it's complicated still further, of course, when we get into Chamber of Secrets, and now we add a new temporal tier. So we're talking about what's happening now, and we're talking about what's happening a decade ago, and we're talking about what's happening 5 decades ago, 4 decades ago, I suppose. We're talking about these different unfolding stories, and those different unfolding stories, the amount of time, the temporal distance between these events exerts an interesting pressure, a pull, a tug on Harry. We are never allowed to forget in the pages of the novels that Harry is the inheritor of a problem that has been a long time coming. He is the representative of a force for good that has been, or arguably a force for good, but at least a force of agency, a force of heroism that has been present in the wizarding world for functionally forever. But in the movies, we modulate that a little bit. Partly this is a consequence of space, but it's also intentional in that it tightens our focus to Harry. We simply spend less time with Lily and with James. We spend less time worrying about the mechanics of what happened way back when in the Wizarding War. We worry much less about, what happened to Tom Riddle. The amount of time that we spend on Tom Riddle in Chamber of Secrets in the book versus the film. And remember that the film of Chamber of Secrets is incomprehensibly slavish to the events of the book. Like a smart adaptation of Chamber of Secrets would have cut most of that stuff too, because it just doesn't matter. And it actually hinders the reveal. It is both incomprehensible to people who haven't read the book, but also frustrating to people who have read the book. It is, the worst of both possible worlds. It falls between two narrative stools there, like pretty badly. But by removing this temporal pressure, by removing this tug of the past on Harry, we tighten the focus dramatically. We are now, in the frame of the third movie here, so much closer to Harry's experience than we have been previously. We are much more caught up in not the story in the sense of the mechanics of the plot. Many of the mechanics of the plot, we can actually speculate, are still happening in the background. Is there a Fidelis charm? Yeah, probably. The Marauders? Yeah, sure. They were still the Marauders. All of that stuff exists in the periphery of the story. You don't get it exposed to you if your only knowledge of this story is through the film, but it's all out there if you choose to go looking. But by pushing that out, what we're getting is less of the story of Harry Potter, this split and temporally fractured story, and more of Harry's experience of the story of Harry Potter, if that makes sense. We're getting a much closer first-person experience here. And that leads to a number of consequent decisions, which I think are very smart. We can't have Ron and Hermione fighting for the entire movie. We just can't have Ron and Hermione fighting for the entire movie, because we need Ron and Hermione to be there for Harry, to, as they always do, reflect and externalize his experience of these events, his experience of these plots, his fear, his challenge. And when we alienate Harry from Ron and Hermione by pairing him with Lupin, we're doing so intentionally. It doesn't work as well in the film, I think, if Ron and Hermione are already on the outs and Harry is forging this stronger relationship with Lupin, this much more personal relationship with Lupin, this potentially darker relationship with Lupin. We need Ron and Hermione to be solid because we don't have time to do the story, and our perspective on Harry and these events is necessarily different. Again, I'm just having so much trouble keeping up with the chat. I do apologize, you guys. Let me scroll down here. Leo's taking off. Leo has taken off, I guess, by 10 minutes now. I do apologize. It is late. I know it is late. I am going to try and reschedule some of these as we move forward for more European friendly time zones, more East Coast friendly time zones, try and make it so that everyone can get along to at least one of the discussions for Wizard of Earthsea, at least. Yeah. Yes, Angela says, but I felt that people who didn't read the book missed the big emotional payback when Prongs appears. Yes, in a connective, lore-oriented kind of way, right? We don't understand how the pieces fit together. We don't get a sense of the jigsaw puzzle of this plot, but I do think that simply the emotional impact, that not the intellectual reward, but the emotional reward of the stag appearing is maybe not just as powerful, but is still powerful in and of itself. Yeah. Let me see here. Oh, Art has stopped by. Thank you so much for joining us, Art, here in this special. I can't believe I've been running for a half hour already. This is crazy. Okay, good. Everything seems to be working. Alexa says, for those who like character aesthetics, she's been linking out to the Pinterest boards there. I think there was also a Hermione Granger board on my Pinterest as well as stuff for Common Room, Graphic Cast, and Point North. Alexis, you're wonderful, and we adore you. You're wonderful, and we adore you. Yes, good. Let me scroll back here. Yes, Angela Malfida says, responding to Angela here, I think that's why it works. It tracks Harry's emotional journey. Yeah, I think that's the argument, right? Is that this is less about the world of Harry Potter and more about Harry's experience of the world of Harry Potter. And I think that's a pretty bold choice. We get some other kind of efficient cuts made. We get one Hogsmeade scene instead of, gosh, 2, 3, multiple Hogsmeade scenes, I guess. We get some purposeful reframing, just smart narrative choices, like the reframing of the conversation in the bar in Hogsmeade, the idea that Harry is eavesdropping thanks to his invisibility cloak, rather than just sitting at a table in an open bar listening in on this conversation. I gotta tell you, that works that much better for me. We get... yeah, we drop some of the stuff about Snape. Of course, most of the stuff about Snape we drop. There's just a lot of efficiency, kind of a lot of clutter is stripped out, even if that clutter is itself rewarding and somewhat satisfying. So that's really when we look at Prisoner of Azkaban as a story, when we look at Prisoner of Azkaban as a coherent narrative unit, what we see is that much more focus. We get that much more punch. We get a more directed and muscular kind of storytelling that is consequentially, well, both consequentially and incidentally, that much closer to Harry and his experience, which I think is one of the reasons that Prisoner of Azkaban works as well as it does. And when I say closer to Harry and his experience, I would be remiss if I didn't also note that we are simultaneously a little closer to Hermione than we have been previously, a little closer to Ron than we have been previously. We're just, as our characters are expanding into their adult spaces, we're able to get that much closer to them and engage with them more purposefully. So yeah, good. Okay, let me see here. Where are we? This is a bonus, Brittany, just so we can wrap up the season. Or is Brittany asking about what we're doing? Yes. No, I had to take last week off, I'm afraid. You guys can... Now I am coughing inopportunely, or perhaps perfectly opportunely. I had to take last week off because of illness. And as you can hear, I'm still not quite recovered. I'm still not quite back, but the Manhattan is treating me right. Art says, I love the fact that Harry's Patronus is a stag. I love the connection to his father. It always makes me think it's like his father's presence is still with him and watching over him. Yes, and Malfidus points out, and it's a stag before Harry knows that that's his father's animagus state. Indeed, we don't talk about animagi in the movie version of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, or at least not in the same way, I guess. We get some of the same beats, but they're not represented with quite as much depth and thought. This might actually be a really good opportunity to talk about this connection between Harry and James, to talk about not just the Patronus, though of course the Patronus is in many ways the perfect encapsulation of the relationship between Harry and James, but that's not the only point of connection between the two of them. We get so many points of connection between the two of them. As we are drawing in the novel, at least, myriad connections between Harry and Sirius in terms of their present experience, in terms of their incarceration, in terms of their responses to injustice, and so on and so forth. While we're doing all of that very deliberately and flashily, I suppose, we're also drawing these connections between Harry and James. Harry is, of course, the spit of James. It's no coincidence that now all of the sins of the father, I suppose, are returning to us at this point, now that Harry has kind of come into his fullness, not into the full measure of his adulthood, not into the full measure of his heroism, not even into the full measure of his nature. He is still, as adolescents are, somewhat at war with himself, but he is now in the full measure of his Jameshood. He is now perfectly representative within the context of Hogwarts of his father. He is a perfect stand-in for his father. Of course, he's a physical, a perfect physical simulacrum of his father, except, of course, as we note over and over, for his mother's eyes. So what is the connection between Harry and James within the pages of this book and within the frame of this movie? Well, it's fascinating, honestly, because Harry's primary point of connection to this point has either been with his parents in the abstract or with his mother specifically. And this is the first time that we're really delving into the emotional content of his relationship with his father. And it would be perhaps superficial of us not to acknowledge the biological transition that Harry's going through. The biological transition is perhaps less important than the emotional transition, but Harry is undergoing his adolescent, threshold liminal state right now. He is transforming from the child into the man. And I think that it is fair to say that in many cases, the boy needs the mother more during his childhood years, but as he becomes a man himself, looks to his father as a model of manhood, honestly, as a model of adulthood, certainly. And I don't mean to, tritely or trivially gender this. I'm talking about, this specific circumstance. And certainly there are so many alternate modes of interpretation, so many other alternate kinds of relationships, so many other means of interaction, so many other frameworks that are established around these kinds of relationships that I certainly don't want to generalize too far. But I think that for Harry specifically, well, Prisoner does kind of feel like the year. His third year at Hogwarts does feel like the year where he starts to become a man, when he starts to become aware at least of what being a man will mean. Think about the agency that he takes, thinking about wanting to kill Sirius Black, thinking about wanting to take direct action with Sirius and with Lupin. And, he has stumbled through these juvenile adventures before, but this is very different. This feels fundamentally different, as he is, of course, being pushed back against by the structures of his society. Yeah. Let me see. Yes. Oh, okay. Art's actually throwing forward to book 4 and a moment that will make us all weep. Yep. Good. Absolutely. I'm not going to spoil that here in the chat, but you're completely right. Something of the soul in a Patronus, says Elizabeth. And that's a really interesting thing. Okay, let's try and talk about this mechanistically, right? Let's try and talk about this objectively and dispassionately. Is there any conceivable mechanism that would account for Harry Potter's Patronus being a stag, being the form that his father voluntarily took? Well, let's establish our terms here. The animagus cannot choose his form. The animagus transforms into an animal, but it is like the summoning of a Patronus. It is like unlocking an alternate identity, right? This is something that you are. You can't readily, as far as we know at this point, shapeshift between different forms. When you become Minerva McGonagall is a cat. That is all that she is going to be in her animal form, Sirius Black is the Grim. That's all he's going to be in his animal form. Why is that significant? What does that tell us about how people see themselves? Does it tell us, here I am begging the question, does it tell us anything about the way that people see themselves? Does it tell us anything about the random quirks of magic? Is there something totemic about the animal form that you adopt as an animagus? Possibly. Certainly, if we look narratively, if we look textually at the Marauders, then yeah, there certainly is. What do we see from James? What are the qualities that we associate with a stag? Well, we see, honestly, none of his mischief. We see none of his marauderness, I think, in that. But we do see James the adult. We see the protector. We also see the leader, the noble spirit, the monarch of the glen, as it were. We see someone who is apart. Stags exist in community, yes, but stags themselves are never directly communal creatures. They don't consort with their own kind very freely or very frequently. Rather, they lead, right? If we're thinking about the stag and what it represents, we're thinking of leadership, not just, of course, because of the animal itself, but because of the associations with royalty. Do we see a connection between Sirius Black and the dog? Well, absolutely, yeah. We see loyalty and ferocity and a dauntless kind of devotion. Those are absolutely the kinds of virtues that we associate with dogs in fiction, and absolutely the kinds of virtues that we associate with Sirius Black, right? And then, of course, Peter Pettigrew, the rat. I mean, that kind of speaks for itself. So is it fair to say then that the animagus form is somehow representative of the nature of the person itself? Well, not definitively. I don't think that we can say that and put a button on it and say, yeah, that's the truth of the matter. But I do think that we can speculate in that direction. I do think that that is fair speculation. What then do we make of the Patronus? Can the same be said of the Patronus? Well, again, at this point, we have very little idea. But ultimately, I think, yes, ultimately, I mean, we have some idea at this point. The manifestation of the Patronus, the ultimate physical manifestation of the Patronus, as a representation of the individual's defiance of despair, right? It's not just hope and courage and gushy warm feelings, it's not just clap your hands and believe that you can fly. It's nothing quite that simple. It is broader than that. It is the rejection, the repudiation of despair and hopelessness. That does seem to take a form that is in many ways similar to the form taken by the animagus. So what does that tell us about Harry? And yes, I'm jumping ahead a little bit there, but I'm not going to give specific examples. Yes. Jillian says, well, okay. So Jillian says, we know from later books that someone's Patronus can change. Does that mean their animagus can change too? I want to see an academic essay about the relationship between, and now it scrolls. Look at this. Between the animagus and the Patronus. Is that what you were going to say, Jillian? I hope that it was. An academic essay about the relationship between the animagus and the Patronus, or whether it's a correlation or something more. And Malfida says, I thought I read somewhere that a wizard's animagus and Patronus would be the same. It's entirely possible, right? It seems as though it is. And okay, even if it isn't, what do we see from this connection? What do we distill? What do we infer? What do we discern about this connection between James's animagus form and Harry's Patronus? Well, okay, it is tempting to lean toward the mystical, the theological. It is interesting it is tempting to lean toward the idea that yes, you know what? Harry carries some fragment of his father's soul within him. And that's not, I think, an incompatible perspective on this text. But even if we don't go that far, we can see that strictly speaking, or we can speculate at least that strictly speaking, mechanistically speaking, the same is true. If the animagus form and the Patronus form are both outpourings of an individual's core identity, if they are in some sense definitive of what makes that, or illustrative of what makes an individual that individual, of what makes you, then the fact that Harry and James share this connection, which seems to be textually supported, indicates that they are the same. That even if Harry is not magically or mystically carrying a fragment of his father, he's carrying his father. He is his father's son. We don't have to necessarily invoke a magical or a mystical answer to this in order for it to be both true and compelling. Though, as I say, I'm not against the idea of allowing for a mystical interpretation of this, or a theological interpretation of this, a cosmological interpretation of this, a magical interpretation of this. I think all of that is completely fair. All of that is completely fine. All the more so in the book, where we get so much more time spent on the animagus and on the Patronus itself too. Yeah, good. We will certainly circle back around to the notion of the Patronus in future books. I think I mentioned this when we got to the Expecto Patronum chapter in Prisoner of Azkaban. I think that Expecto Patronum is my favorite spell in Harry Potter. I think that it is, and not just as a fan of these books, not just as a lover of, the wonder, the magical wonder of Harry Potter, but as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about stories, thinking in particular about fantasy stories and fairy tale stories. There is something about the Patronus charm in both its incarnations, both the silvery light of the low yield Patronus charm and then the actual manifestation of the full Patronus. Both of those things that I find completely fascinating. And of course, it speaks to me personally, philosophically, about hope and the defiance of despair, about courage and these virtues which we tend to limit, at least early in the Harry Potter series. We don't spend as much time talking about courage and talking about, the actual manifestation and consequence of courage as we might. But yeah, good. Let me see here. Yes. Karen points out, since James died at 21, adolescent James really is James, or all anybody ever knew of him. Absolutely right. To what degree was... okay, I want to be careful about this. To what degree was, because of the circumstances of his life and death, to what degree was adolescent James peak James? To what degree was that the Jamesiest Potter? To what degree was that as much James Potter as we were ever going to get? Because immediately after he leaves Hogwarts, the world is very different. The world is very challenging. And as you say, he dies very early. This, I think, is probably going to be a more productive conversation when we circle back around to it in the future. But yes, it is very, very distressing to think about that, and to think that Harry, even as he is standing tremulously on the threshold of his adulthood, even as he is undergoing the tempest that is adolescence, he's also creeping ever closer to the death of his father. That's analogously the death of his father. That's a really powerful thought. That's a really powerful idea. Yeah, as I say, though, we'll circle back around. We've got a lot there to talk about in the future. Yeah, good. I don't know. I'm now curious whether or not there is an Animagus quiz that you can take over at Pottermore or out there on the internet that is like substantially different from the Patronus quiz, or even... Because, of course, hey, here we are talking about external realizations of internal virtue, and somehow I haven't mentioned the sorting hat. Somehow I haven't gone back to, one of the basic precepts of life at Hogwarts, the sorting hat. Is the manifestation of one's house similarly kind of indicative of one's own personal virtue? And I know we're going to talk about will and choice with regard to the sorting. Again, later in the series. As of this moment, we have no reason to believe that choice plays any role whatsoever in the sorting process. This is going to be something of a retcon from J.K. Rowling. But can we see these things as being part of the same kind of continuum here? The house that you are placed in, the house into which you are sorted at Hogwarts, your potential Animagus form, your potential Patronus form, is all of this indicative of a worldview that we get from J.K. Rowling, which states that the nature of a person is, well, not immutable, but somehow fundamental. That you are, in a very important and philosophically significant way, you are who you are. Perhaps. Hey, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit in Goblet of Fire. Maybe we'll get a little chance to talk about this much later. Yes. Good. Let me, yes, good. Gray says, isn't there something to the sort of wild, independent, youthful aspect of stags that we could apply to James in addition to the sort of royal adult side? Yes, absolutely. It's not, yes, no, you're right. That's a much better way of putting that. Thank you. I was kind of struggling to articulate that when I was talking about, community and gregariousness, and that's not quite what I was getting at. But you're right. An independent, wild, unrestrained side, right? A kind of creature that is not, at least, and again, we can separate, real life stags from, the mythic conception of the stag, a refusal to be bound by expectation, a refusal to be bound by convention, arguably, right? Those two sides of James's personality, absolutely working in harmony within the stag there. Yes, very well put, very well put. Yeah, and Malphidus says, I wonder if James and Sirius and Remus were suspicious when Peter transformed into a rat for the first time. Well, okay. I mean, yes, they should have been, right? Oh, a rat. Huh. Do you want to take that again? Maybe just maybe you can do better. But of course, we're also in wizarding culture here. And there's no suggestion, I think, when we're talking about rats as familiars, when we're talking about the presence of rats within Hogwarts, we're not really dismissive of them as vermin. We're kind of speaking to that magical potential, that kind of medieval idea of the witch or the wizard's familiar. So it's entirely possible that when Peter Pettigrew transformed into a rat, the other marauders were like, Cool, check out your magical potential. You're embodying one of the creatures most readily associated with the practice of magic. Good for you, my faithful friend, Peter Pettigrew. Maybe, but yeah. Rayla Lynn says, Rayla Lynn is joining us. Hello, Rayla Lynn. Rayla Lynn says, the stag makes me think of the Baratheon symbol from GOT. What happens to them again? Oh, dear. Yes, exactly, right? The Baratheons from Game of Thrones there, kind of, again, representing those two impulses. Yes, the royal monarchistic line, but also, crucially, that wild, untamed, out there in the wilderness kind of line too. Yeah. That's a good connection. Yes. Good. Gray says, in fairness, one of them is a werewolf, so maybe they weren't too thrown by the rat. That's true, actually, at that point. Yeah. Though I do wonder if James and Sirius transformed back that first time and we're like, thank God, it could have been so much worse. I'm Sirius Black, and I'm going to learn to be an animagus, and I'm a duck-billed platypus. This is going to make the rest of my life that much more complicated. Yeah, I mean, also, I don't know why I was doing Batman voice, but except that that's where my voice is leading right now. So yes, good. Jillian says, I feel like each individual animal has the possibility to have so many different qualities, though, jumping forward a bit. But both McGonagall and Umbridge have cat patronuses. They share no qualities other than that. Hey, you know what? We are going to talk about the connection between the genuinely awful and hateful Dolores Umbridge and Minerva McGonagall, the sainted and beloved Minerva McGonagall, because I'm going to contest ultimately your proposition a little bit there, Jillian. I am going to contest when we get to that point that actually Minerva McGonagall and Dolores Umbridge have much more in common than it seems. It's just the really important stuff that they differ upon. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. Yes, good. Let me see as I catch up again. Okay. I think I'm all caught up. I think everything is fine. John says Umbridge, the anti-McGonagall. In some ways, certainly. Yes. Good. Oh, Becca says I'm talking like Batman because of Bat Month, and Elizabeth is pointing out that Bat Month was last month. It's true. I spent the entire month of October talking about Batman properties for the Excelsior podcast over on commonroomradio.com. You can head over there and hear me talking about, the Lego Batman movie and Batman 1989 and Batman Returns from 1992 and Batman The Long Halloween, which is one of my favorite comic series that I have ever read. It's very good. You can find that over at commonroomradio.com. Yes, Alexa says, aren't McGonagall and Umbridge the opposite sides of the same spectrum? That's how I always saw it. Yes, but here's the thing about that spectrum. It's not a line, it's a circle. And when you are on opposite sides of the spectrum, actually the physical distance between you can be very, very small indeed. What is the difference between Dumbledore and Voldemort? What is the difference between Harry and Draco? What is the difference between any of our opposed pairs that we present in the course of the Harry Potter series? And we haven't really had much opportunity to talk about opposed pairs yet. Ultimately, of course, what is the difference between Harry and Voldemort too is the kind of the ultimate example of that. When you get so very far apart, you start getting really close together again. And that is definitely one possible interpretation of the relationship, or not the relationship, but that is one possible interpretation of the character dynamics between Minerva McGonagall and Dolores Umbridge. Hey, you know what? We're going to have, yes, as Ryan's pointing out, I thought we agreed not to mention Umbridge while we didn't have to. Now I'm angry. I know, I do apologize. That's absolutely fair. We're going to have to talk about her at some point, and that's going to be a tough ride, but we don't have to talk about her until we have to talk about her. Yes. Good. Okay. That, I think, is going to do it for our thoughts. Was there anything else that I wanted to? Yeah, some minor stuff, but you know what? It's fine. We will catch up with the rest of our thoughts on Azkaban probably when we talk about Goblet of Fire, because of the ways in which Goblet of Fire is textually reflexive of Prisoner of Azkaban more than any of the other books in the series. Let's take a look at our questions here, and then I should probably wrap up. Oh, an unfair but brilliant question from the wonderful Tolkien lover here in the chat. What would Lily's Patronus be? We don't find out Lily's Patronus, do we? And I'm aware, even as I say this, that there are three possible answers to what I'm saying. Do we find out what Lily's Patronus is in the books? Do we find out what Lily's Patronus is in the movies? Do we find out what Lily's Patronus is thanks to Pottermore or some extra textual source? I don't know what Lily's Patronus is. If I had to guess, well, it would be something, I think, that is kind of, in some senses, both antithetical to and also ultimately compatible with the stag. It would need to be something that embodies Lily's great virtues, which were mediating virtues in terms of her relationship with James. For all that James is wild and independent and untamed, Lily was communal, was capable of when I say communal, I mean capable of creating community. She was, in a sense, kind of quintessentially traditionally feminine in the same way and to the same extent that James was quintessentially traditionally masculine, I suppose, in that, hey, you know how men don't do community and women only do community, and that kind of slightly outdated, very simplistic take on gender. I do think that there's an interesting truth to that, or at least there can be an interesting truth to that, depending on the individual. And certainly I see that represented in Lily and James. Gosh, I don't know. What are the suggestions here in the chat? I know that you guys are going to shout this out. Let me see. Yes. Yeah, Lily's Patronus. Well, okay. Yes, Lily's Patronus is a doe. Yes. Princess Ostrich says J.K. Rowling sometimes said it was a doe, but I ignore that because it is dumb. Okay. Yes. Well, again, right? What? We're going to have to talk about all of this when we have that much more information. Based on the information that we have now, I would probably lean against a doe, actually. I don't necessarily think that that would be what I would expect Lily's Patronus to be within the frame of Prisoner of Azkaban. I'm not sure what I would expect it to be, but probably not that. That seems a little too literal and a little too, I don't know, subordinate to James's form, I guess, to his Animagus form. But once we get to the point where we can start, you know, dealing with this a little more mutably, then our answers are necessarily going to change. Rayla Lynn asks, do you think that JK knew that Scabbers would be something different? The scene in book 1 where Ron fails to turn the rat yellow makes me wonder. No, I don't think that J.K. Rowling knew that Scabbers was not going to be a rat in the first 2 books, but I don't think that that prevents us from enjoying a marvelous bit of inadvertent foreshadowing, right? The fact that, I mean, okay, and also we should separate the conscious mind of the author from the subconscious mind of the author. Did J.K. Rowling possibly know on some level, in some way, that Scabbers wasn't just a rat when she started writing this series, or was open at least to the potential? Maybe. We cannot speculate about that because that way leads to madness. You know, we can't go down the road of crediting to the author's subconscious things, which evidently aren't true in the author's conscious work. No, I don't think so. I don't think that Scabbers was intentionally something else. But as I say, we can definitely enjoy the moment of unintended foreshadowing there in the first book. But it is interesting. Yeah, good. Okay. I think, guys, that is going to do it. I know that I'm wrapping up a little early. I know that we're only an hour in, but I have to apologize here. My throat is just all but giving out on me. And I have many other podcasts to do this week. And I think we've reached a natural resting point here. I did, foreshadow this a little bit by saying that it was going to be a slightly shorter discussion. That is, I think, going to do it for our discussion of Prisoner of Azkaban. Let me put up this slide here, warning you all of next week's session. Next week, A Wizard of Earthsea, chapters 1 and 2. That is The Warriors in the Mist and The Shadow. We will have that discussion at 10 p.m. Eastern next Tuesday, November 21st. And a quick word of warning, too, for those of you who keep up with my Tolkien series, There and Back Again. Next Thursday, of course, is Thanksgiving here in the U.S., so I'm not going to do a Thursday session for There and Back Again. Next week, I will instead do a Wednesday session for There and Back Again. So don't worry, you're going to get your regular show next week. It's just going to be a whole day early. But next Tuesday, excuse me, we are going to talk about the first 2 chapters of Ursula K. Le Guin's fantastic young adult fantasy series, fantasy novel, I should say, A Wizard of Earthsea. I cannot wait for that discussion. I urge you all, excuse me, my voice really is packing up now. I urge you all to go and pick up a copy of A Wizard of Earthsea and read along with us and join me for the live session next week and enjoy that discussion. Guys, thank you all so much for being here with me through Prisoner of Azkaban, through my favorite Harry Potter novel, through my favorite Harry Potter movie. But you know what? Watching Prisoner of Azkaban has only made me more excited to go on and read the rest of the books in the series. And I must admit that cracking open Goblet of Fire this morning, Yeah, it brought back some feelings. I'm going to have a lot to say. We're going to have some great discussions about Goblet of Fire in the early months of 2018. I cannot wait for all of that. Thank you all so much for your support. If you enjoy what I do here at Point North Media and you would like me to do more, if you would like to help, pay the bills and keep the studio operating, and who knows, maybe someday healthcare so I can take care of this throat, then you can head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. and pledge your support there. $1 a month or whatever you can afford makes all the difference in the world, and I am extremely grateful. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining me for this journey. I will talk to you all again very soon. But for now, and for perhaps the final time, unless I decide to resurrect this for Goblet of Fire and the subsequent episodes in the series, let me just say to you, mischief managed. Good night.